So there have been some requests for this presentation from the Lake Trout Aging Workshop in 2017, put forth by Jihe with the Michigan DNR, among others. I've been asked to distribute this, and this is probably the best way to go about doing it on YouTube here. So this is Section Quality and Development of Lake Trout Maxilla. I'm Bill Wellenkamp, and I work at the Michigan DNR Alpena Fisheries Research Station. So, Maxilla yield perfect, beautiful sections that allow you to have accurate, perfect age assignments every time. Yeah, not a chance. There is no perfect aging structure. There's even errors in coded wire tags somewhere along the line where there's a misread tag or something else of that nature. Nothing's perfect. Whoever cut this one shouldn't be a technician anymore. That'd be me. They've moved me out of that. So the point here is that image on the left that is very difficult to read was the first cut, one of my first there in 2012. The section on the right is the same bone. You can see the holes that are visible, showing it's the same one. It's a much better section. It's just a matter of having different light and a little bit more practice. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the characteristics of good Maxilla sections. First and foremost, you want a high level of contrast between the light bands and the dark bands. One annulus is the light band plus the dark band. That's the full year of growth increment. You want good contrast between them. We'll talk a little bit about each of these in the forthcoming slides. Second thing you want is the appropriate number of annuli present, of course. You also want equal annulus representations in all areas of the section if possible. That makes interpretation a lot easier. Fewer irregularities, holes, etc., and clean focus. First, that high level of contrast. I'll talk about some of the things influencing that. Mainly the thickness of the section. You want to be from 1/10 to 4/10 of a millimeter. Often we cut several sections and compare the appearance. The image there shows one that was cut too thick on the left and too thin on the right, and pretty good in the middle there. On the left you can see that the contrast is not really there between the light areas and the dark areas, and on the right, not only is it too thin, so you have light flooding through the entire section, but the cuts were not parallel. They actually cut off the medial edge of that section. The other thing you want to pay attention to is your light source intensity. You don't want to be flooding with too much light like this. Here's an example of light being a little too bright on the section. Number two, you want appropriate number of annuli. A big part of that is where you cut it on the bone. You want to be from 25 to 40% of the length from the proximal end. That's the snout end, where the knuckle is on the bone. You want the appropriate thickness and the false annuli to be easily identifiable. So this image here is way too thin. In fact, parts of it have actually fallen off because it was cut so thin. That increases the light penetration and floods out your annuli. The sectioning location is fairly critical. So you want to be toward the proximal end. Stay out of the distal end, because if you think about the way that bone grows with the fish, it grows proximally to distally. So the distal end doesn't even have your recent years in an older fish. Your early years, excuse me, because basically those first couple of years are only visible toward that proximal end. So the area between the red lines is your sweet area, and your sections should be taken from there. You can take them toward the proximal end from there, and the annuli will be present. There tend to be more holes and pockmarks, however, at that end. Here's basically how those annuli are present in the proximal end compared to the distal end. The image on the left shows you a complete set of annuli. Looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 or so. Another area within that sweet zone, within the acceptable area. Another section shows 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. As you move distally, you end up with fewer and fewer annuli, down to maybe 3 at the far end. Now, to avoid the presence of false annuli, that's not necessarily something that you can do with your processing. That's more a function of the growth patterns of the fish. Nonetheless, a good section will have fewer false annuli like that on the left. You can see the sample on the left at about year 5 and 6. There are some faint false annuli there. It can be identified though. They are much more faint than your other annuli. The sample on the right has a lot more in the way of false annuli, so a lot more interpretation that's going to have to happen there. Ideally, you would want equal annulus representation in all areas around the sample, roughly symmetrical between the medial, that's the rounded side, and the lateral, that's the side on the right, the flat side. The text there says the proximal side, that should say lateral. Ideally, you'd be able to follow your annuli all the way around the section. You want limited irregularities in pores. You can see in this image a high number of very large holes that makes interpretation a little bit more difficult. Nonetheless, the annuli are all still there. You don't tend to see, we've never seen anything like this in the wild. This is hatchery brood stock. My assumption is that it has something to do with the feed that those fish are eating. Not sure what it is. You do not see samples like this in the wild. About the worst we see in the Great Lakes area seem to be from the Lake Ontario fishery. Not exactly sure why. Here's an example of a Lake Ontario hatchery fish. The holes are much smaller. They're not terribly difficult to age, these sections, but they do have a higher number of holes in the sections. So far, we've never had one where the holes make it impossible to age the section appropriately. Comparison I have with that is the Vateratic otolith. In Lake Huron, anywhere from 25 to 75% of hatchery fish are going to have a Vateratic otolith. In many of the studies that I've read, the Vateratic otoliths are taken out of the study sample. That can present difficulties if you have a low sample number and you end up throwing out 75% of your samples. Most people feel the Vateratic otoliths aren't ageable or interpretable. Maxillae don't have that problem. We don't have Vateratic maxillae. We have some maxillae with holes in them, but it doesn't prohibit successful aging of that sample. Finally, you want to clean focus. Hatchery fish have more noise or more marks in their focus area. We are looking into why that might be. So far what we're seeing is that there are false annuli that show up while the fish is in the hatchery before stocking. That could be raceway changes, food changes, any number of things. We're looking into it, but ideally you'll have a clean area in there to judge that first year worth of growth. Natural fish don't tend to have these stocking checks or hatchery checks, if you will. We do not skip any annuli in wild fish. We have no evidence to support doing that, whereas our known age fish that we have looked at tell us that our hatchery fish have false annuli in the middle that need to be skipped, generally one. So a little bit about changes to our quality over time. We really haven't changed very much since 2012. We've had now we're up to four, that says 3. We've had 4 technicians now that have gone through it. And just some minute changes, really. You can see on the image on the left, a little bit of a yellow color, not quite as clear as we would like. And in 2017, a pretty good image there. Equipment is the same. We are still using that same Dremel from there. It's 2013, and I'm still using the same jig that I built in 20 minutes. It's a very inexpensive system. I think the most appropriate comparison equipment-wise in research was that developed by Marginal. He used something like this to section walleye spines. I want to say that was around 1983 or so. We use the same thing. The only thing we have changed is we use a steel cutting disc instead of a graphite cutting disc. We find the steel to be it's less flexible, more durable, it lasts much longer. That lack of flex gives us better cross sections to interpret. We get parallel cuts. When you cut the cross sections out, you want the 2 cuts to be parallel so that you have a flat cross section with the same thickness all the way across the cross section. With the graphite blades, they bend, and oftentimes you will have a thin side versus a thick side, which can make interpretation a little bit more difficult. Some examples of some older fish, and I attribute the clarity of these to the use of the steel blade, and our technician Ed Barr, his determination in getting very clear images. They're very ageable fish and quite old. Another thing we found is that lighting is pretty important. We use transmitted light generally, that's with the bulb coming up through into the dissection scope. We've also found Darren Bernacki recently has been using reflected light with pretty high success. Sometimes a section might show its annuli a little bit better with reflected light. It's worth looking into. We also find that our white balance function is really valuable on our imaging software. That's Spot Basic or Image Pro. That's really why we moved away from the yellow or goldish hue in the image on the left and more to a clear white natural coloration on the right, and is working with that image balance. Another thing is microscope reading can work really well. What I mean by that is no imaging. Looking through the eyepieces, you have added clarity. You don't have a grainy appearance. It's really good for those older fish when they have compressed annuli in their later life history. So in 2012, we went from a few hundred samples, moved on through into 2013 and onward. Those are some examples of our 2012 sections. Again, we have the yellow color. Tend to be a little cloudy on a lot of the samples. In 2013, things started coming together pretty well. In 2014, Alpena Fisheries Research got a new technician. After 4 months, that technician had really done well with the technique, achieving images like those on the right. For training here at Alpena, we use our abundance of coated wire tagged fish that we get from our Lake Huron Fisheries Independent Surveys, as well as creel samples collected. Those are known age fish. So we cut and image those coated wire tag fish along with fin clip fish. We do have fin clip hatchery fish in Lake Huron. They're on a 6-year rotation. There is some overlap, so it's not completely reliable. However, it's excellent for training because generally you're going to be able to know if that fish is within its 6-year rotation or not. We also have someone, our trainee, observe previous images of coated wire tags, and our burn-in period or preparation is tracking agreement with a 50 fish subsample of coated wire tags. Usually it's going to take 1 to 2 of those testings to get acceptable accuracy. That's above 65% perfect agreement. So within 50 or 100 fish, those ages are ready to be used by our modeler, Jihi. For our side-by-side comparison in our published paper, I worked with Darren Vernacki. Darren had not done very much aging at all at that point of Maxilla for lake trout. And that being said, he actually was a little bit more accurate than myself. So that tells you basically it doesn't take a whole lot of practice, training, or knowledge to be able to age these fish very well. 65% perfect agreement on initial reads. Experienced technicians should be much higher than that, 80 to 90, 95%. In our tests, that's been very comparable and often better accuracy than otolith reads for lake trout. 2015 to 2017, new technician at Alpena. His ages were immediately useful, have a high level of detail in these images. Again, the steel blade helped, and Ed was kind of a detailist and used a lot of time on these to really get excellent images. So we have some tricks here, and they are tricks, and we do not use these as decision rules. They're worth mentioning, but they're wishy-washy, and we don't want to mistake these for scientific methods at all. It's just things that we have noticed. For instance, in Lake Huron, the third year annulus is very easy to identify. I'll go through that in a couple slides here. We also pay a little bit of attention to cadence. Fish tend to grow based on their metabolic rate, which is influenced by seasonal prey densities, etc. So it would be highly unusual to have annuli at fairly steady increments and then have two annuli very, very, very close together. False annulus is generally what that is. Another thing we can do is flip over the section. Flip it over and read it. A lot of times the light is going to go through that section just a little bit differently, or there was a better polish on that section on one side versus the other. Speaking of polishing, sometimes with very old sections or other sections, our technicians do polish using lapping paper or perhaps 1200 grit sandpaper. The other thing we can do is oil it. A little mineral oil will make those annuli jump out. Here's some examples of the third year trick. You can see with the yellow dots marking the annuli, the first annuli, the second, and then the third one, there seems to be a stronger growth period there. So the medial side, which is marked with the yellow dot on the left, is bumped out. And what you'll see is a pattern in Lake Huron with Lake Huron fish where the third year bumps out away from the second and produces kind of a bulbous medial side on the bone. So what we've learned to do is sometimes if there is a lot of noise per se and near the focus, we will simply look for that third annulus because it does seem to be so distinctive here in Lake Huron. You see the yellow dots marking the annuli, 1, 2, and the third annulus bumps out toward the medial side, creating a bulbous medial side. Same thing there. And another example. Ed Barr, our old technician's opinion of quality after a first year experience of about 1,500 samples. He figured 10% were poor, 60% were good, and 30% were excellent. There are some examples of those. What needs to be made clear here is that even the poor ones are very ageable, and the accuracy is just the same as an excellent sample. Out of the thousands and thousands of samples over the past, 7 years now that we have processed here at Alpena, there has only been one sample that has not been ageable. It seemed to be a mutant. The formation of the bone was wholly incomplete and kind of tangled, if you will. 2014. Examples of poor cross sections, nonetheless ageable. Here's some examples of good, what we classify in a very loose qualitative manner. These are good ones. This is a nice example of counting both down the medial radius and the lateral radius, the medial being on the bottom of the image and the lateral on the top. If and at all possible, you want to have a matching number through both radii. If you don't have a matching number going out to the lateral radius and out the medial radius, then something's wrong with your interpretation, or you need to pay attention to another section. because the bone grows out both sides. Here's an example of a good image with a stocking check or some other life event that happened after the first year annulus was laid down for this fish. An example of a 20-year-old. This is an earlier image. Since this was made, I think we have improved our processing to space those annuli out and get better contrast between the light and the dark. Here's some examples of excellent samples. You'll notice in the excellent samples, a lot of the fish are wild fish. In the annotation, they're listed as an ID number, and then on the second line, an age with a designation next to it. NC is no clip, so those are wild fish. Other designations might be AD, which is adipose clip, or CWT, coated wire tag, and then other fin clips as well. There's a wild fish and an excellent example of the symmetry that would be ideal in every sample. Unfortunately, they're not all like this. So I'd like to bring attention to the lateral ventral area of the sample, which is the tip of the tooth. You see an arrow pointing down, and how the annuli in this area are spread out. Makes them very easy to read and count even a slow-growing fish where the medial radius on the bottom of the image has fairly compressed annuli that can be a little difficult to interpret. That lateral ventral area toward the tip of the tooth, those annuli open right up, and it makes aging very easy. The difficult thing about this is highly dependent on how the bone is processed or who is processing it. There are small changes or variations in the way each processor cuts these samples on the Dremel, and that can affect whether the medial radius or the lateral radius is easier to read. Basically, it depends on the angle of the bone as it crosses the Dremel blade. The way I cut them, I end up with a really clear lateral ventral radius. Ed Barr, on the other hand, would often have a very nice medial radius to age the fish with. "14-year-old coated wire tag fish." Fin clipped fish, 16 years old. Very nice image. Still a relatively old fish. There has been some concern that this will only work on younger fish under, say, 15 years old. We have not found that in any way, shape, or form. I personally tend to think the older ones are easier than the younger ones. It really shouldn't make any difference, but it works very well on old fish. So we'll look at a few examples of those. So 19, 21, fish is from British Columbia, which is relevant because this technique doesn't simply work for Great Lakes fish. That's where we are refining it, but our partners in British Columbia are working with some fish out there, seeing a little bit different growth patterns, but nonetheless still very able to identify the annuli of those fish. 26-year-old fish from Saginaw Bay, Lake Huron. Highly compressed growth in the last 15-20 years of that fish's life. 27-year-old. This is a wild fish. It's not known age, but as you can see, the annuli are very distinct. It agrees with the otolith age. This is an otolith. This is the otolith from that same fish. I certainly prefer the maxillary to trying to interpret this. This was most likely much easier to read through the eyepieces of the microscope. I'm sure that the imaging of this otolith has increased the blur and graininess and made interpretation more difficult. Another example, 29-year-old from Lake Superior. And there is the comparable otolith. It's a really nice image. Our partners up in Marquette at the Marquette Fisheries Research Station, Sean Sitar and Dan Trainer, are working up there with the technique, and this is one of their nice otolith sections. Comparable ages. A Lake Superior 34-year-old. As you can see, growth is very slow for this fish. The last image and this image and the next one will all be from the same maxillary bone from the same fish. And it's to illustrate the differences in your sections. As I mentioned, very often you want to have multiple sections, especially if it's a very old fish and you're having trouble, so you simply cut another section and compare. And sooner or later, and in this case, I think it took me 3 cuts or 3 sections to come up with a very ageable cross-section. It's a 40-year-old fish. The otolith was aged at 38 or 39, Dan Trainer up in Marquette tells me. So comparable age on a 38 or a 40-year-old fish. That level of accuracy is generally acceptable. So the takeaways is don't get disappointed. Some people right away end up with near perfect images, and again, part of that depends on the population you're sampling. That population, its relation to the forage base, etc. But the processing in general and the interpretation come pretty quickly. The training period is short. It doesn't take terribly long to get to a consistent level of excellence, of high quality images. So keep at it, and the very good ones will start showing up. So a few links to more information, rather than putting the links down, just type into YouTube Maxilla removal lake trout processing, and you can see the other titles here. We have excellent images and a fine paper from Beth Murphy with the U.S. EPA, Great Lakes Fish Monitoring Program, shifts in the age of Great Lakes lake trout. We use the maxillary method to compare fish among all the Great Lakes and relate that to contaminant sampling. We took the maxillary bone from those fish and compared them in a side-to-side study against otoliths, and our accuracy, speed, and precision were higher with the maxillary bone. Finally, we have completed a study on non-lethal sampling of maxillary bone from lake trout in a hatchery environment. The results of those studies can be seen in the ResearchGate North American Journal of Fisheries Management publication listed there at the ResearchGate site. Survival was very high among all of the samples, controls, and treatment samples where maxillary bones were removed from the fish. Mortality was equal, comparable between them. So it's useful, at least in a hatchery environment, for a non-lethal sampling as well. So thanks to our biologist, Ji-hee, for continuing with the development of the technique, Fred Barr, and his awesome slides. I want to thank Sean Sitar and Dan Trainer up in Lake Superior for the great old fish samples, the fats that they sent to us. Beth Murphy for the multi-lake samples throughout the Great Lakes. And Amy Nowakowski for successfully aging a 40-year-old fish after absolutely no training. So it tells you a little bit about how easy it is to age these fish when someone that's never looked at them sits for 15 seconds and ages one that's 40 years old and nails it on the first try. So I think that's all I have. So thanks a lot for watching. And again, please contact us at the Alpena Fisheries Research Station. I can help you, Bill Wellenkamp or Darren Vernacki, our fisheries technician. And finally, Ji-hee is our resident lake trout biologist. And any questions you might have, we're available for you. Thanks for watching.